Hello, dear ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to our webinar today. My name is Mari Lyra, and I'm working as Regulatory Affairs Manager at Medfiles Food and Feed Unit. It's great to see so many participants online. Thank you for your interest to join us today. Our topic today is how to register food ingredients and dietary supplements for the US market, GRAS and NDI explained. Because we have only 1 hour time and a lot of information to share, I will immediately proceed to the housekeeping of the webinar. Enjoy. So, the webinar will be recorded. Everyone will get the recording afterwards. All the participants are muted so that we don't disturb each other. A time for questions is at the end of the webinar. And what is very nice is that we received several advanced questions and those will be replied. If there is any time, which I doubt, then we may reply also to the questions via chat, but I don't promise anything. You can see webinar agenda over here. So first I will introduce Medfiles and our presenters today. Then we have a short poll. We start by looking at GRAS and NDI in more detail. Then we will hear about GRAS and NDI registration routes and requirements. And finally, it's time for the conclusions and questions. And at the end, we have closing and feedback. Here you can see Medfiles service areas. And Medfiles is almost a 40-year-old company located in Finland, European Union. Medfiles provides services related to human and veterinary medicines, medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, as well as food and feed products for organizations and businesses of all sizes. In addition to regulatory affairs services on all of these fields, we provide also clinical study services on foods, medical devices and human medicines. Related to our food and feeds unit services, we cover a wide array of regulatory affairs services in the EU, UK, US, Canada, and Singapore, from food and feed labeling to regulatory dossiers and regulatory consultation and clinical studies. Via our global partners, we may provide services also in Asian and other countries. Here you can see our experts. We have 12 highly qualified experts with vast experience in labeling, regulatory science and reports, and health claims and nutrition working in the unit. Our over 25 years of experience guarantees deep expertise in all the consultation work, including also strategic advice in challenging regulatory projects. And now it's time to introduce our presenters today. So I'm Mari Lyra, and I'm a nutritionist from my background. And I have regulatory expertise for over 25 years. I have been working in consultation work through my whole career. And then Mari Eskola, PhD, she's working as Senior Regulatory Affairs Expert. And also she is a team lead of regulatory science and reports. Her background is food analytical chemistry, and she's also a food scientist. Mari also has a long career, and she's the former EFSA, European Commission, and European Chemical Agency staff member. And she has food safety expertise for over 25 years. Ingrid Hagberg is our toxicologist and regulatory affairs expert, and also our food scientist. And Ingrid has a former Health Canada staff member history, and she has regulatory expertise for over 10 years. And then we have time to our poll. So the question for today is, are you planning to start preparing a US registration via GRAS or NDI dossier? And you can see our poll under chat, and you can also now give your answer. Let's have a few seconds for that. Looks very nice. So it looks like the answers go about 50-50, so that no plus I don't know yet. So they take approximately 50% of the answers, whereas yes, within from 1 to 2 years, or within from 3 to 5 years, it takes another half. Okay, thank you very much. This is nice to know. So we have people coming from different backgrounds, and the answers are very, very well response to that. Then, when intending to market new food ingredients in the US, either in conventional foods or in dietary supplements, companies must register their products in the US. Mostly, the clients use GRAS or NDI registrations to get their products to the market. So in this webinar, we learn how GRAS and NDI registrations work and how they differ, how to choose the correct registration pathway for your food ingredient or new dietary supplement, and very interesting, what upcoming FDA changes may mean for future US market access. So after that, I think we can dive to the GRAS and NDI details. So, how to identify an applicable registration route for a new food or dietary supplement ingredient in the US? There are these 3 registration routes available. So, food additive petition, abbreviated FAP, so it's meant for food ingredients. And in practice, this means that the applicant need to submit a petition for the FDA. And FDA will then authorize the food additive to the market after a favorable opinion. Generally recognized as safe, abbreviated GRAS determination means that it's also meant also for food ingredients. And GRAS determination can be done via self-affirmed mode or GRAS notice to the FDA. The third one, NDI notification, is targeted only for dietary supplements. And the way to register these new dietary ingredients is to submit a notification to the FDA. And having presented these 3 different routes, I can say that the story is, however, not always so simple, because there are US regulations that make this straightforward approach more complicated. And based on that, I can say that identification of the correct registration route is essential. Here you can see the practical example. So between the years 21 and 24, so during 4 years, at least 12 of total 136 new dietary ingredient notifications submitted to the FDA resulted in no response by the FDA, since FDA considered the route not applicable. And the reason for that was that the notified substances were not identified as dietary ingredients. And based on that, and naturally, doing and submitting a non-correct regulatory dossier causes unnecessary work and effort. And of course, we want to avoid that. But to open this topic a bit more, I need to start with reviewing the definitions of GRAS and NDI. And some other concepts as well. So let's take the next slide. Here you can see the GRAS definition. So GRAS is a regulatory designation defined under Food, Drugs and Cosmetics Act in the US. Any substance that is intentionally added to food is a food additive that is subject to pre-market review and approval by FDA, unless the substance is generally recognized among qualified experts to be safe under the conditions of intended use. So basically, GRAS substances are a type of food additives in the US, but they are not legally food additives, which require a pre-market approval and petition to the FDA. And Instead, as I already stated, so a self-GRAS affirmation or GRAS notice to the FDA is needed for these GRAS substances. Then we look at the definitions of new dietary ingredients and dietary supplements. So NDI means a dietary ingredient that was not marketed in the US in a dietary supplement before 15th October 1994. There is no authoritative list of old dietary ingredients marketed before that date, but there is so-called unofficial grandfather dietary ingredient list of dietary ingredients that were used in dietary supplements prior that date. FDA has also commented that list that it's not comprehensive, but I would say that it can be somehow indicative list of those old ingredients. And different to European Union, so dietary supplements are not regulated under Food Act, but they are regulated under Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act from year 1994. And dietary supplements are defined that they are products intended to supplement the diet, and they are not in the form of conventional foods, but in the form of tablets, capsules, powders, soft gels, and liquids, and so on. And they need to be labeled as dietary supplements. Then, when we talk about new dietary ingredient, we need to talk about the dietary ingredient concept. And dietary ingredient is defined also here in Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act. A dietary ingredient is either a vitamin, a mineral, an herb or other botanical, an amino acid, a dietary substance for use by man to supplement the diet by increasing total dietary intake, or a concentrate, metabolite, constituent, extract, or combination of any of the above dietary ingredients. Pretty easy until that, isn't it? So a substance is not dietary unless it belongs to some of the above categories. But then we come to the more complicated part of this. So additionally, to be a dietary ingredient, the ingredient or substance must have been present in the food supply in conventional foods in any country, also outside the US. In the same chemical form, it's intended to be used in dietary supplements. And FDA doesn't consider prior use in dietary supplements to constitute presence in the food supply. And this is, of course, natural because they are sold in chemical different forms, and also the regulations are different. So the prerequisites for the new dietary ingredient are that the substance must be a dietary ingredient. And I will give you an example. So if the new substance is, for example, a fatty acid that is present in the same chemical form as in vegetable oil or marine oil present in food supply, for example, olive oil or some fish oil, as intended to be used in dietary supplements, then it's considered as a dietary ingredient. And if it has not been used in dietary supplements in the US prior to 15th October 1994, then it's considered as a new dietary ingredient. But if the substance, for example, fatty acid, that is again present, for example, in olive oil or in fish oil, and which is present in food supply, but it has not been used in dietary supplements prior 1994, and it's now intended to be used in dietary supplements, but in altered chemical form. Meaning that, for example, the triglycerides in the oil, they have been hydrolyzed and reesterified, resulting to the concentration, for example, 1 or 2 fatty acids. So it means that it's not anymore a dietary ingredient because this altered chemical form is not present in the food supply anymore. And for that reason, it can't be an NDI either. And it means that new dietary ingredient notification is not an applicable registration route for that kind of ingredient. So if the company anyway wants to register this new substance and use it in dietary supplements in the US, so what do they need to do? How to make a new substance a dietary ingredient? There is a need to present this new substance in food supply, meaning conventional foods, for example, snack bars. But because this is a new substance in question, so it would need a registration in conventional foods first. And for that, either a food additive petition, which is not generally used, but rather GRAS determination, GRAS registration in the US is needed. After, for example, this GRAS registration has been done, either by self-affirmation or by submitting the GRAS notice to the FDA, so this new substance needs to be introduced in food supply, in conventional foods in the US market or anywhere else. But of course, when we talk about the US registration, so then it's natural to present that in conventional foods in the US. And only after that, new substance is considered as a dietary ingredient, meaning that then it can be also a new dietary ingredient. And what makes this procedure even trickier is that once this new ingredient that is intended to be used in dietary supplements and for which the GRAS registration was done, it changes the situation for the NDI notification so that the NDI notification is then a volunteer process. Because according to the US regulations, when the new dietary ingredient is present in food supply, it is exempted from the new dietary ingredient notification requirements. Still, the FDA recommends to submit the notification. And it's also the case that US customers may require a new dietary ingredient notification after GRAS determination, because especially if the company did so-called self-affirmed GRAS. So it means that this GRAS dossier has not been published anywhere. So it's not generally available. And for that reason, US customers may require to submit the new dietary ingredient notification, which will be published on the FDA's website. But if the GRAS notice was submitted to the FDA, so it will be published, and then all that data will be available also for general public. So this might be the requirement. And summary of GRAS and NDI. So it's very essential to identify the correct registration route for a new substance to be used in foods or dietary supplements. And for food ingredients, either FAB or GRAS is the correct registration route. For ingredients in dietary supplements, it's good and recommended to define whether the substance is a dietary ingredient. And based on that, either the NDI notification or GRAS or both are applicable procedures. And if there is a GRAS registration, it needs to be remembered that an introduction of the new substance in food supply is needed. So thank you. This was my part. And then we will go to the generally recognized as safe part. And Mari Eskola, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marilena. I will take it over from here. We seem to have some technical problems, but let's hope things are running. So I think it's on everyone's lips at the moment that what's going to happen in the US for the self-GRAS. And therefore, I thought that I will, excuse me, I thought that I will tell you about the status of the self-GRAS issue in the beginning of my part of the presentation. But before doing so, I think that it's good to understand of the history of the GRAS concept. And therefore, I think that I will a little bit describe the GRAS concept, what it's all about. So 1958, the GRAS was established, and that was done through the food additives amendment to the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. And the amendment stipulated that the substances can be approved as food additives or used as GRAS substances if they are considered safe for consumption. At the time, Congress established the pre-market approval for food additives, but excluded GRAS. So what this means, it means that the FDA has the statutory authority only over the food additives, but not GRAS rules. So therefore, for example, FDA does not approve GRAS sent to FDA, but it just gives a letter. The original intention to exempt the common food ingredients with a long history of use from the lengthy food additives petition process, that was really the main intention, not to invent the GRAS, that it's easier for these typical foods. In 1970, as a request of the President Nixon, the FDA started a project to assess all the GRAS applications. But this was then terminated in 12 years later because it was really resource intensive and the FDA ran really out of the resources with that. 1997, then FDA proposed a rule for voluntary GRAS notification, and that was formalized 2016, and that's the FDA's final rule, which is now governing the self-affirmed GRAS determinations and the self-affirmed GRAS determinations which are notified to the FDA. So since 2016, the current GRAS rules have been in place. Here then a bit what we know at the moment, what's happening to the self-GRAS part. And this is the one which is not notified to the FDA. I have to say that this discussion has been going on already a lot before Trump's administration, because there were some Democrat congressmen which were discussing that the self-GRAS route should be scrapped because it's a loophole. But then when Trump administration started, we all know that it started saying that to make America healthy again, and that is really the slogan of the health secretary of Robert Kennedy Jr. So on the 10th of March last year, the Kennedy Jr. instructed FDA to explore whether there could be a new rule to eliminate the self-affirmed GRAS pathway and how to do that. And that's called now FDA GRAS ruling, what they're going to do about it. That's just a term for this presentation, not an official one. So the important here is to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that the FDA does not have the statutory authority over the GRAS. So we don't know what's going to happen. This is interesting. What would this FDA GRAS ruling then want or means? That would mean that there would be a mandatory GRAS notifications to FDAs. So you cannot anymore do a self-affirmed GRAS and leave it in the drawer in your factory or in your company. And FDA would naturally also keep going with the inventory on GRAS notifications. Currently, we know that this FDA's GRAS ruling or FDA proposal is reviewed in the White House, but we expected something to happen already in last month, but nothing has happened yet. So let's see when something is going to come out. Then half a year later, last year, in the 6th of November, there were one congresswoman and two congressmen who proposed a bill, and that's called Better Food Disclosure Act 2025. And again, it says the same thing as the FDA GRAS ruling would say, or the proposal is saying, that the mandatory GRAS notification has to be submitted to FDA. But the additional part of this is that the health sector should approve the GRAS list. And this bill also says that the previous self-affirmed GRAS substances, which are there on the markets, should be notified to FDA within 2 years. However, we have heard from US that this bill would be difficult to implement. So it's difficult to say whether this would go forward at all, or whether it's rather the FDA GRAS ruling proposal. So what to expect on these self-GRAS discussions in the US? We know that the FDA proposed rule, when it's been published in the Federal Register, which we are now waiting for, then the industry is allowed to have a comments for 60 to 90 days. And we expect that there will be an awful lot of lobbying and also industry resistance for this, whether it's an FDA proposal or the Congress proposal. So also there has been discussions that the costs and benefits should be evaluated to weigh the benefits for public health against the workload for industry. Let's see whether it's going to happen, because indeed, on the other hand, the Trump administration is saying that it should be easier to get on the market for the industry and so forth. And anyway, the FDA would require more staff and funding if the self-GRAS ruling will be deleted. My question is, or my thinking has been that whether this outcome of this entire discussion, which is ongoing now, would be the same as we have for the historical precedents, showing from the Nixon's time, whether then at the end it's found out that actually it takes too much time, money, efforts, and human resources to go evaluating all the GRAS notices. Let's see. I also know that there are some discussions at the FDA that already setting up some AI-based tools or IT-based tools. So that's what I've also heard offline. Let's put it that way. If you want to hear more about read more about my thinking of what's going to happen to GRAS, you're very welcome to go to read my blog, which is on the Medfiles website. Then, as a second part of my GRAS presentation to you, I was thinking that I would go through the GRAS definition a little bit more in detail. So I have made some words in bold in this definition. So as we already heard, it's GRAS is kind of generally recognized as safe substances are substances intentionally added to human or animal food that are recognized by qualified expert as safe under their intended conditions of use. So let's look a little bit more detail what this means. But before to do that, I would just like to say that the GRAS can be demonstrated in two possible ways. The number one way is the through scientific procedures supported by robust and publicly available scientific evidence, or through the common use in foods prior to 1958, based on the substantial history of consumption data. However, this second one is hardly applied any longer. So it's really the scientific procedures which are used nowadays to get the GRAS status, whether self or self-GRAS submitted to FDA. So let's then look at the generally recognized. What does that mean? GRAS status through the scientific procedures is based upon the application of generally available and accepted scientific data, information, or methods, which are ordinarily published, and as well as the application of scientific principle. So what does it mean? Generally available and accepted scientific data, information, or methods. What does that mean? That means that general recognition of safety requires common knowledge throughout the scientific community knowledgeable about the safety. So all those scientists across the world who are working with your substance you want to have a GRAS for, they should acknowledge that your substance is GRAS. Ordinarily are published. That means that no secondary data are permitted to demonstrate the safety of the GRAS substance. For example, EFSA opinions are not allowed. Only primary data are permitted. In practice, this means that the safety data used for GRAS determination must be published in a good quality peer-reviewed journals. Otherwise, the substance does not satisfy the generally available and the ordinarily published ruling. The generally recognized equals to knowledgeable scientific community, equals to qualified expert, equals to GRAS panel as a surrogate. And on my next slide, I'm going to explain to you about the GRAS panel. So what is the GRAS panel? It's not the FDA experts. The GRAS panel is something that to satisfy the GRAS ruling, i.e. recognized by qualified expert as safe, that's the GRAS panel is a kind of industry invention. So industry invented a GRAS panel mechanism to satisfy this GRAS ruling part. GRAS panel is so to speak, a surrogate to the scientific community knowledgeable about the safety, i.e. to the whole world covering scientific community who knows about your substance and is sure that it's also safe. So the qualified experts, they must be able to conclude that the substance is not harmful under the conditions of its intended use, which are access to public information, meaning the public information is the peer-reviewed papers. Important is to note that the GRAS panel does not reassess your GRAS determination. It only sees whether they agree or not that your GRAS determination or your GRAS substance is GRAS, that your GRAS determination concludes that your GRAS substance is GRAS. And typically, GRAS panel, it often asks for some clarifications. Normally, the GRAS panel, it contains 3 to 4 experts. They are normally toxicologists, risk or exposure assessors, chemists, and typically from USA. It's important to note that it's a company's responsibility to arrange the experts for the GRAS panel, but they must be independent from the company. So it cannot be your risk assessor in the company who will join the GRAS panel. You also saw in my previous slide that I had bold the wording intentionally added, and this is already what Mari told you earlier. So it's intentionally added. This GRAS substance is intentionally added to human or animal food. So it's a type of food additive, although it's not a legal food additive as Mari mentioned, which would require the petition to FDA. GRAS substances are safe under only their intended conditions of use. This was another set of words I had made bold in my previous slides. So it's important to remember that if a substance is GRAS, it's not always GRAS. So substance is only GRAS under the defined food groups to which it has been added and at the dose it has been determined to be safe. So i.e. under the intended conditions of use. It's also important to note that the FDA says that there must be a reasonable certainty that the substance is not harmful under the conditions of intended use. So no 100% certainty, okay, that's I guess never possible. Data requirements for GRAS dossier are the same as for any risk assessment. So legally, FDA says that the FDA rulings on GRAS, the current ruling says that the data requirements are the same for both forms, whether it's an FDA notified GRAS determination or self-affirmed GRAS determination. The FDA also knows that the quality and quantity of evidence required for GRAS determination are equivalent to those required for the US food additive petitions. So it means that the data requirements are similar as for any risk assessment. So typically the data are analytical studies, toxicological studies, human dietary exposure assessment, and here it's important to note that there needs to be US consumption data to be used in the exposure assessment, not EFSA data. Safety assessment is an important part, of course, and that's usually the margin of safety of 100 is used, but in FDA guidance is even 1,000 margin of safety mentioned. And it's for all population groups, so GRAS is always done for all population groups starting from 2+ years onwards. GRAS dossier shall contain all these 7 parts. If it does not, it's not considered GRAS dossier. So these 7 parts need to be in both GRAS forms, whether it's a self-affirmed determination submitted or not submitted to FDA. And the 6th part is the most important, the narrative, where you describe why your GRAS substance is safe, but also other parts are important. And certain data of these, typically the manufacturing data, can be requested to be treated confidential by FDA. And my last slide before I give the floor to Ingrid is the tips for FDA notified GRAS dosers, but these are also applicable to the one which is not notified to FDA. Important thing is that know risk and safety assessment principles and methods well, because FDA does not really provide a very good guideline. So you need to know yourself what the risk and safety assessment, what it is, its principles, and the methods which are currently used. FDA is a little bit different from EFSA, and it really recommends to have a pre-submission meetings. When you have such a meeting, have a very good plan ready. Don't go with empty hands. Have a good plan how you want to address the safety of the GRAS, and preferably have already some data to show to FDA and discuss. Remember also in these meetings, FDA has always supported the US industry first, so they might not be so happy to have a Europeans there. So have a thought how you tackle this. FDA aims to evaluate the GRAS notices within six months. This is the minimum one, but they usually need more time, so it's the +3, so usually 9 months. But this is also getting longer now because FDA lost some important staff members when the Trump administration came in the power. During this evaluation period, there will be requests typically from the FDA and for the additional data and clarifying certain aspects. And for these clarification requests, you don't get too much of time, so you need to be fairly quick. Remember, when you go right into GRAS doser, whether self-GRAS one or the self-GRAS one which you will notify to FDA, write just enough to determine the safety, but not all possible details as in the dossier you would be writing for EFSA or the UK FSA. Important is to remember that GRAS dossier will be published by FDA. So this is from my side, and now I give the floor to my colleague Ingrid. Ingrid.
Thanks, Mari. So I will now go through the NDI registration process, and I will go through some considerations and information that is helpful to know for this. So to start, I want to go back to the definition of an NDI in a dietary supplement. Mari Lura already discussed this earlier, but this is very important for your NDI. So an NDI is a dietary ingredient that was not marketed in dietary supplements in the US before October 15th, 1994. And this is what gives it the NDI part of the dietary ingredient. Whereas a conventional dietary ingredient is any one of the following: a vitamin, mineral, herb or other botanical, amino acid, a dietary substance for use by man to supplement the diet, or a concentrate, metabolite, constituent, extract, or a combination of any of the ingredients described above. So it is very important to keep this in mind when you are looking to do an NDIN, because a substance must be a dietary ingredient to be considered an NDI. If it does not fall under that definition, then the NDIN pathway is not applicable and it will not go through. Also to consider, if a substance was marketed in conventional food prior to 94, but not as a dietary ingredient in dietary supplements, it is still considered an NDI. But for this case, as long as it is not chemically altered, then an NDIN, so the notification, is not needed. So this means that the FDA does not need to go through that evaluation process to market that one. Marketing a dietary ingredient in dietary supplements outside of the US prior to 94 still means that the substance is an NDI. So the key part here is that it needs to be marketed in the US to be able to get that exemption from the NDI status. Also to consider, manufacturing changes may affect the status of a dietary ingredient. This is particularly important if it is considered chemically altered. And Mari Lura went through this a bit earlier, and I will discuss later on in the next slide. But also, even if it is not chemically altered, if we're looking at things like changes to the identity, different impurities, differences in bioavailability, then that may no longer be considered a conventional dietary ingredient, even if that same product was marketed before 94, but the manufacturing changes may have bumped it over into an NDI instead. And now for chemical alteration of a dietary ingredient is outside the definition of an NDI. So any chemical alteration of a conventional ingredient means that the NDIN pathway is no longer available. Where it gets a little tricky is that the FDA does not actually maintain any exhaustive list of chemical alterations. They have provided examples, and I've listed a few, and these are such as making or breaking chemical bonds, using solvents other than water or ethanol, changes to molecular composition or structure, or the use of nanotechnology. So this is also a very important consideration to think of when going through an NDI process, if there is any chemical alteration to the product. Now, as Mari mentioned, with the new US government, there have been a lot of significant regulatory changes. And of course, with GRAS is a very big one right now, but also the NDI area has been affected. Luckily, NDI is not nearly as affected as the GRAS area, but the FDA has listed the NDI regulations as part of the Human Food Program deliverables in 2026. So in this case, they have a few deliverables that they want to do. One of them is that final guidance will be released, and that will detail the safety and identity requirements for an NDIN. And this becomes particularly important because these two sections tend to be some of the biggest issues when industry applies to for an NDIN. So the hope is that this new guidance will allow industry to better fill out those NDINs, and then will allow for more approvals of NDINs instead of rejections. The FDA has also mentioned that they will explore communications to inform stakeholders about the latest updates and developments in the NDIN area. Also, streamlining of the review of the NDINs is one of the key issues that the FDA is bringing forward as part of this deliverable. There has been a significant growth in the dietary supplement industry lately, and this is what the FDA is doing to help meet that 75-day timeline. And this 75-day timeline, I will go into a bit more detail later, but essentially once an NDIN is submitted, the FDA has 75 days to either accept or reject that NDIN. So we can see here that the FDA is committed to maintaining that 75-day timeline. And the last one is where things may get interesting, because the FDA has plans for what they call targeted enforcement strategies on violative products. At the moment, we don't have any further details, but it seems like they may be looking for increased inspections and definitely looking forward to sort of target products that have been skirting or circumventing the regulations. And I will talk a bit about this later, in a possibility for this in the next slide. Now, GRAS and NDI are two completely different registration processes, but they are linked a little bit. So, for example, if a substance has a GRAS status and it has been used in the food supply and will be used as a dietary ingredient without chemical alteration, then a separate NDI notification is not needed. And this becomes really important for those substances that are not under this NDI definition, but still would need to be used in dietary supplements. The regulatory pathway for these would be slightly different, where they would need to go through the GRAS process, be marketed in the food supply, and then they can move over to the dietary supplement industry. So it is a bit of a circumvention, but it is completely within the regulations, and this is how those non-dietary ingredients can get into dietary supplements. It's also important to note that even in this case, companies can still submit an NDIN to the FDA should they wish. In this case, it may be that clients request it. And also important to note that there is no standard on how long the substance needs to be in the food supply before it can go over into the dietary supplement area. We also know that in practice, many companies will actually market their dietary supplements with GRAS status without ever marketing them in food. And this does carry a small risk should the FDA inspect the product. And as I mentioned before, with the FDA now committing to more targeted enforcement, this sort of loophole might now be more part of their increased surveillance. So they may be looking for this going forward. Now, for NDIs, there's also labeling considerations. So as part of the NDIN, companies must disclose the conditions of use in labeling of the product, or if there are not any specific ones, then just ordinary conditions of use. And for instance, the companies can dictate the maximum dose of the product based on the conditions of use and put this on the label. So this could be something, for instance, as take 2 capsules per day and do not exceed the recommended dosage. And now this becomes a bit advantageous compared to GRAS, because GRAS, of course, is in food and we cannot restrict food consumption. So for GRAS, to ensure the safety of consumers, we need to protect the sort of high consumer at the 90th percentile. And then the allowable limit of food is then calculated based on that. And that means that the average consumer will actually get significantly below sort of the max dose. But for NDIs, we have the advantage of labeling, and that we can just state on the label what the maximum dose is. And then there's no need to worry about sort of the high consumer of the 90th percentile. There's also the option of restricting the use of the NDI in certain consumer groups. And sort of the most common ones that we see are in children and pregnant or lactating women. And this can also be very helpful in determining the maximum dose of the product. Children are actually a very good example of this, because in foods, the safe use or the maximum dose tends to be limited by children consuming the products. And that's because children tend to eat more food per kilogram of body weight, and that makes them more sensitive to any sort of hazardous effects by a product. But for an NDI, we can simply restrict it by saying that children should not be consuming the product, and then that is one risk management strategy. Another very common group to restrict are pregnant or lactating women. We know that it is a very high burden to prove safety of any sort of food product or dietary supplement in pregnant or lactating women, and there are significantly difficult and high pricing toxicology studies for this. But one method of avoiding this is to simply exclude those consumers from the NDI. So in this case, they could be excluded on the label, and then that is considering managing that risk. It is also important to note that even if a company does want to market their NDI to pregnant or lactating women, the FDA may consider that there's not sufficient data to support that, and then they may require the use of this restriction in order to approve the NDI. So it can also work the other way, in that if the FDA does not feel that it's safe, that they may require this restriction even if a company does not want it. And now for some considerations for the NDIN. As I mentioned earlier, the definition of a dietary ingredient is narrow. Even if a substance is safe and it has all the toxicology and safety data in the world to support it, if it is not under that NDI definition, it will get rejected for an NDIN. So it's very important to make sure that your product is in that dietary ingredient definition. And even outside of the definition of NDIs, many NDINs are still rejected. As I mentioned earlier, incomplete safety or identity data are also one of the main reasons that the FDA will reject an NDIN. Compared to GRAS, an NDIN does not require published safety data. So if a company has, say, in-house toxicology data that is not being published, then that is acceptable to use in an NDIN. On the other hand, the NDIN dossiers are published. This is the same for an FDA GRAS, but self-GRAS dossiers are not. So when you are writing your NDIN dossier, it is important to keep in mind which sections you need to claim as confidential, so those do not get published. And now the dossier structure for an NDIN, I have listed the 4 main points here. And the FDA has a template for the NDIN dossier, and that is found in their online submission platform. So it is thankfully very easy to follow the NDIN dossier structure because the FDA has highlighted every section that you need, and then you just fill out the information there. I would like to emphasize again, as Mari mentioned earlier, data requirements are the same as for any dossier. So there is no sort of easier route between an NDIN or a GRAS dossier. The amount of information and the quality of information still needs to be the same. For submission of an NDIN, it is done electronically. As I mentioned, the FDA has their own e-submission platform where you can upload the information. And the FDA must receive an NDIN 75 days before marketing of the product. In practice, this means that the FDA will accept or reject the NDIN within 75 days. So this is an advantage for the NDIN, as it is a very quick turnaround compared to the FDA GRAS. But also within those 75 days, you can typically expect that the FDA will request additional information from the applicant about 2 to 4 times. And lastly, some sort of tips and tricks for your NDI notification. Again, I would like to emphasize that please make sure your ingredient is a dietary ingredient. If it's not, that NDIN route is not going to be available. And as Mari mentioned earlier, know your risk and safety assessment principles and the methods. The FDA does not provide as detailed guidelines as EFSA does. And again, pre-submission meetings with the FDA, these are also available for your NDINs, and I would highly recommend it. You will get some very good advice from the FDA on your submission, and you can come forward with some questions or concerns prepared that you may have. I would also like to echo what Mari said, to have a very good plan ready. The meetings are only half an hour and they will go by very quickly, and it is very to the point. So it is very important that you are well prepared and ready for those meetings. The FDA will evaluate the NDIN in 75 days. So this is thankfully a very quick route to the market, but we also need to keep in mind that during the evaluation period, additional data and clarifying information can be requested. And as I said, that may be 2 to 4 times. It's also important to remember that those additional information requests do not change that 75-day timeline. So you need to be prepared to reply very quickly and expect only a few days to answer all the questions that the FDA will have for that specific information request. And as same as with GRAS, remember that write enough to determine the safety, but you do not need the same level of details that is required by EFSA or the UK FSA. And lastly, remember that your NDIN dossier will be published by the FDA. So it is important to remember when you're writing to highlight which areas are confidential so that they do not get published as part of that dossier. And then now I would like to switch back over to Mari Lura, who will go through the conclusions.
Thank you, Ingrid. I hope everyone there on the online is happy with the provided information. It's plenty of information, but I hope you have learned a lot. Anyway, to conclude what we have heard today, so it's essential to know the US regulations and requirements, I could add, and identify a correct registration route for a new substance, especially when intended to be used in dietary supplements. Both GRAS and NDI registrations are based on generally used risk assessment principles and methods. And on those, you can rely on Medfiles. So don't hesitate to ask assistance. We are very experienced on the area. And the future of self-GRAS concept is unknown, and a mandatory GRAS filing to the FDA is possible, but we don't know that yet. Also, some changes on NDI regulations to be expected. But I just want to market ourselves that we will be updating you via LinkedIn, via our newsletters, and so on. So keep online. But now it's time for questions. We are perfectly in time, so let's take the advanced questions first. So the first question, and actually two questions which I combined here, were how do you see the future direction of the self-GRAS system? And we discussed this earlier, so I hope you listened to all the details what Marie provided for you earlier. Then the second question, possible to register for Europe-based companies or a subsidiary needed? Ingrid, what would you say about that?
Yes, so it is possible. There is no need for a subsidiary for a European-based company, but it is always useful to know your distributors.
Thank you. The third question, what are the advantages in choosing an NDI application over GRAS and vice versa? Ingrid.
So NDI and GRAS are two very different areas. As we said, GRAS is for food, and that includes all of the 2+ year consumer groups. And that is also used to go to the NDIN route if your product is not considered a dietary ingredient. NDI is only for dietary supplements, and that means that consumer groups can be limited. And also to note for those of us in Europe, the terminology here is slightly different. In the EU, what the US calls a dietary supplement is a food supplement, and that is considered as a food and under the food regulations, whereas in the US, a dietary supplement is not legally considered food.
Thank you. Then we take the fourth question, which is FDA's view on precision fermentation and synthetic proteins in relation to GRAS and NDI. Marie.
Yes, thanks. FDA has the same view as any regulatory authority. So the both production organism and the product, they must be safe. So that's exactly the same. Also, synthetic proteins, they must be safe, and the allergenicity issues, they're very important. And I see now that FDA is really putting more efforts on the allergenicity issues, so this is getting really, really important also in the US side. Important bit is to note when we look at the NDI, though, is that about the synthetic substances that, for example, synthetic vitamins, minerals, and amino acids, those are not considered as the new dietary ingredients. But for example, synthetic protein, because the synthetic it's a synthetic copy of the natural protein, has never been in the food chain that is considered as a new dietary ingredient. So there are little differences.
Okay, thank you. Let's take question number 5. How long would it take to register a novel ingredient for the pet food? What are the estimated costs for the process?
Here I would like to note that there are different parts nowadays to do this. Self-GRAS and the FDA notified self-GRAS, and there's a third route nowadays called AFIC, Animal Food Ingredient Consultation, which FDA launched just the last year. All these 3 parts, they require similar data, although the AFIC part is something that there is no GRAS panel needed, but it goes to the FDA. So when we look at the, let's say, timing, the data generation plus writing the dossier plus panel evaluations plus FDA, it takes at least 1.5 years onwards. About the estimated costs, I'm not able to give that in full, but I'm just giving a bit of a thought. Like, for example, the safety study, which is needed for all these. For example, for canine, it's around 50,000 to 60,000 euros, and feline is a little bit more expensive. So we can start from that there are certainly studies which are rather expensive.
Thank you, Marie. And then we have the last question. Which way to navigate for a nutraceutical and meditech device? So, of course, nutraceuticals either in form of functional foods or dietary supplements, and medical devices are regulated by different regulations in the US and, of course, also in the EU. So a specific case-by-case evaluation is needed. And we are, of course, happy to help also in these kind of questions. But thank you. These were the questions. And as I estimated, so unfortunately, we don't have any time for ad hoc questions. So let's go further. And now we have the time for the feedback. Thank you very much for joining us. And we would appreciate very much if you could give feedback on the webinar so that we can develop our webinars further. Thank you very much. And do not hesitate to contact us whenever you have need. And here at the last slide, you can also see my contact information, and you can likely find that information also on our website. But thank you very much, and we hope to see you online again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.